All right. Well, thanks, folks. Welcome to launching the LF end user community. My name is Brett. I'm with LF and I will be your host today. We are glad you could join us. This is the second of two kickoff events for this initiative, the first of which was held a few weeks back during the Open Networking and Edge Summit. Recordings are now available on the LF YouTube channel. Today, we've lined up use case presentations around oil and gas as well as energy. And just a few notes before we start. The session will be recorded and available later on the LF Edge YouTube channel. And also, I would like to thank our moderator and event host, Gavin Whitechurch, co-founder of Edge Computing World. Gavin, anything to add other than we're running a pretty tight schedule today with the sessions going back to back?
Thanks, Brett. No, just delighted to be hosting the Linux Foundation LF Edge here today. And just a note for everybody who's joining us fresh and hadn't participated in Edge Computing World previously, but this is part of the Edge Computing World event, because you're registered here, you'll be able to access all of the sessions of Edge Computing World of the conference, which largely took place last week, 125 different speakers and sessions there. So lots of content around use cases for edge computing if you'd like to get your teeth into that. No, thanks. Looking forward to the session. Should be really exciting.
Perfect. Thank you. Without further ado, allow me to introduce Arpit Joshipura, GM Edge IoT and Networking at the Linux Foundation, as well as Jason Shepard, LF Edge board member and VP of Ecosystem at ZEDEDA, to get us started.
Thanks, Brad. Let's go ahead and get started. So if you go to the next slide, I'm just going to go give a quick introduction to I think the agenda is already on the web, so we won't want to spend too much time on it. Let's see. I think we have introduced ourselves. So I want to just talk about the broader picture, and then we'll let Jason go into the depth of Edge. But the good news with the Edge is we are narrowing down, what we thought in 2018, where a set of applications, edge applications that required accelerated processing and lower latency, to come close to the application as possible based on 5 technologies, whether it's 5G, microservices, portable container apps, AI, hardware acceleration, on-demand NFV, etc. And these were a set of applications. Now, since that time, in the last just 2 years, this market has moved significantly forward, right? Most of the analysts believe that 5G and edge are critical in the next battle, right? It's the new normal. In fact, some analysts predict that the edge market is 4 times the size of the cloud market. So very, very important here. If you look at some of the other data points from some of the other analysts, if you go to the next slide, in this case, it's KPMG, right? Where some of these markets have taken a look at what edge can offer them and have started working in our community, right? So whether it's industrial manufacturing, oil and gas, retail, homes, automotive, fleet, etc. By the way, in this linear order. Very, very important to note that there is no one edge solution, as Jason will talk about, but these markets have all embarked on an open journey to enable them. So if you look at the next slide, it's also another view of IoT. And as I've always said, not all IoT requires edge and not all edge is IoT, right? So at the level of IoT, if a sensor wakes up and dumps data in a public cloud every week, that's not an edge application, unless it needs latency and treatment and predictive maintenance and things like that near its location. So here's a different view of the markets that are growing from IoT analytics. Similar feedback from them as well in terms of manufacturing, transport, energy, etc., retail. If you go to the next slide, there's a different view from 451, which kind of does 2 by 2. And then, of course, if you look at a lot of the information that Tapio provided from an analyst perspective, this is very consistent and a lot more detail in terms of which applications need low latency, high bandwidth on a 2 by 2. But the good news is we have projects under LF Edge, and I'll give a quick introduction and pass it over to to Jason on that. But our goal in LF Edge is to, unify Edge in sort of a horizontal manner across multiple markets, right? Whether it's cloud, telco, IoT, enterprise, etc. So if you go to the next slide, it's kind of getting to the definition of Edge. So I'm going to pass it over to Jason to sort of go and say, have we solved that problem? I think we have, but community-based definitions are always important. So Jason, take it over on the definition side.
Yeah, we'll do. Yeah, and one thing I'd highlight is you'll notice, well, obviously manufacturing and industrial is a continuously the highest use case, but also you'll notice that a lot of the bias, especially on this slide, is towards the bandwidth side of things. So bandwidth always comes at a cost. So a lot of interesting data there as we look at stuff. So latency and bandwidth are key ones, and then of course security and privacy and autonomy are other reasons for edge computing. But also the challenge is that there's a lot of discussion on edge where people are talking about it in a very kind of myopic way about the edges that they're focused on, and really it's a continuum in the greater scheme of things. So this actually is a view from a taxonomy that we did as a community. We released this white paper back in June of this year. Definitely recommend checking it out. It's you can search online for LF Edge taxonomy paper, and the paper goes into great depths about how the edge is a continuum, and it breaks it down based on inherent technical trade-offs in the landscape. So we hear a lot about, in various forums, thin edge and thick edge, and near edge and far edge, and the industrial edge and the retail edge and the enterprise edge. The reality is that they're all the same foundational infrastructure, but you make different technology trade-offs and architecture trade-offs depending on some key traits. So latency, I mentioned latency just a minute ago. Latency is also an overused term because there's various degrees of latency. Even real time is a bit of an overused term. I mean, real time in a building application might be 15 minutes, whereas of course your airbag, it's quite a different story. So one of the first trade-offs that we talk about in this taxonomy is it latency critical or is it latency sensitive? A latency critical application will always be driven from local compute. You want a local area network. This is also part of the reason why you're starting to see trends around private 5G as an example, but then also of course you're going to run compute closer to process in general. Latency sensitive applications you tend to want to see pushed upstream a little bit for the scale factor, at the service provider edge and across a broad number of users. Content delivery is a great example of that. But that's why we have the two big buckets in the taxonomy of service provider edge and the user edge, and they're separated by that last mile network. So that's that point where you're differentiating between a wide area network and a local area network, and latency, of course, is reducing over the wide area network because of 5G. But then that latency critical application you're still going to see on-prem. And so that was kind of one of the first buckets. The second big bucket, from the on-prem data center edge up, lots of unique considerations, but at the same time, the infrastructure is an evolution of what we've seen in the data center for a long time and in cloud data centers. And we're seeing evolutions of Kubernetes moving down, and how do you deal with distributed clusters, but generally fairly consistent infrastructure and all in secure locations, physically secure data centers, micromodular data centers, et cetera. So that second big delineating factor across this continuum is, am I in a physically secure data center, or am I distributed out in the field where I don't necessarily have a network perimeter? I don't have physical security. People have access to those compute nodes. So there's different security needs when you think about that delineation. So that's the difference between the on-prem data center edge in the right, and then the smart device edge to the left. So the smart device edge is basically any sort of compute that's out in the field that's capable of running apps. So that could be about 256 megs of memory on the left side to a small server cluster on the right side. And of course, there's mobile client devices, PCs, tablets, etc. Solved problems in terms of ecosystem, Android, iOS, Windows, etc. When you look at headless devices like gateways, hubs, and routers and servers and the like, it's very, very messy. And this is a key focus for a number of projects within LF-Edge is how do we tame that? You've got a lot of considerations in the industrial space. How do you balance the needs between the process control networks and segment those off from the rest of the network? And then when you go one more click to the left, now you've got constrained devices. So these are embedded devices, memory constrained, resource constrained in general. The over-the-air update tools tend to be very custom to the devices. There are ecosystems spinning up around that, but they're just different constraints overall. And then when you look at the service provider edge, of course, we're seeing compute move out of the centralized cloud across the internet exchange, regional edges. So these are your content delivery providers. Still a couple hops up from the users, but you're getting closer and being able to deliver all kinds of services. And then, of course, the access edge that's sitting right on top of that last mile network. So as close as you can get, one hop from the end users. And so, it's a spectrum. There's these definite trade-offs. And within LF-Edge, in addition to kind of defining the taxonomy and building a variety of projects, we're looking at how can we create more transportability of workloads across this continuum. And so if you look at the projects, Akraino was one of the anchor projects within LF-Edge. Started more on the service provider edge, and we'll talk about focus here in a little bit. But you're starting to see blueprints within Akraino moving more and more, including more and more of the user edge considerations. And Blueprint within Akraino is bringing together various different upstream and downstream projects and wrapping best practices around that, and they're defining APIs and how they tie together into simplifying how people go deploy various different use cases through infrastructure. You've got a variety of other projects within LF-Edge. We're up to 9 now. Actually, one that's not listed here is a secure device on board, which was just contributed by Intel. Edge Foundry was another anchor project. That's all about IoT interoperability. Fledge is also focused on IoT, more on the industrial sense, but also both projects are able to serve a variety of different use cases. A great example of the different trade-offs between the different edges. So while on the surface they might look like they're completely overlapped in terms of focus, being able to take data from a variety of different sensors and deliver that to applications and do turn that into information. But the projects take different approaches in terms of Fledge being built even more for constrained devices, high throughput of data. EdgeX is built for flexibility and scale. In terms of bringing together a bunch of different applications around a common interoperability API. So, the whole point of LF-Edge is how do we bring projects in, even if they have a little bit of overlap, how do we make kind of fit across the spectrum and see harmonization over time as we develop the projects out. Home Edge is actually a foundational infrastructure project for focused on home use cases. Anything around, think of it as like, how can I build new services around a local server within my house, things around safety and security inside the home, various different AI services for voice recognition, vision-based applications. Home Edge is actually collaborating with the Edge Foundry project for some of the data plane. I think there's also a collaboration spinning up with Open Horizon around container management. Betel, contributed by Baidu, focused on how do you deliver cloud services out to the edge. Open Horizon from IBM as the initial contribution is about how do you manage containers at scale across the continuum. Eve is a project that ZEDEDA, my company, had contributed, and we're building the community there. Eve is focused on how do I build out an OS for industrial use cases that is optimized for compute outside of a data center. So very strong zero trust security model. How do I run both virtual machines and containers so I can support legacy apps and run modern containerized workloads alongside of it? So a variety of things there, and we'll talk about a little bit about that as we go today. But even Open Horizon could be complementary in terms of that baseline foundation that is provided by Eve, and then the container orchestration provided by Open Horizon. And then SDO, as mentioned, it was also recently added. SDO is about secure device onboarding. So this is how do I attach the owners of devices through the channel. So from a generic device shipped in a factory through a channel of multiple exchanges of service providers to an end user, and bind the identity of that device to the end user. To do that across a channel definitely requires some level of standardization. And so the idea around SDO is to go drive that in the community. It's also linked up in FIDO in terms of creating a standard around that methodology. So a variety of projects, again, that we want to see harmonization happening over time within LF Edge. Just some examples. So this is the release 3 of Akraino, and the community is working on release 4, various different use cases, both horizontal and vertical. As you can see, kind of initially focus a bit around that service provider edge, telco use cases, but we are seeing extensions out to the user edge in terms of IoT use cases and various different form factors and whatnot. So we'll see continued evolution there as we go. The net here is how do we collaborate not only within LF Edge, but then also various other projects within the community. Open source is the modern way to drive standards. We're seeing increased collaboration, across the board. Of course, CNCF with Kubernetes, massive community that's developed there over time, and really just the past 3 years. K3S was just recently introduced as a project into Kubernetes. All the great work that Rancher's been driving, and we're seeing those projects also, of course, being brought in through LF Edge into these specific edge use cases. Collaborating with other consortia. We're all better off if we collaborate across the board and drive more of these common elements. You'll notice the Gartner quote within the intro that Arpit gave. It is about, to get to the real potential longer term, it is about open ecosystems. I think the real potential long term is about interconnected ecosystems. So various different use cases crossing over between businesses, B2B to C. So much untapped potential in terms of interoperability and open exchange of data, and some of the next big conversations are going to be around trust. So, and that's going to require open collaboration. I won't go into all the details here. We're going to talk about a couple use cases today. We're focused today on oil and gas and energy. But if you look at the various different projects, we've got use cases, like with Fledge around industrial, IoT, predictive maintenance, leveraging, thermal imaging cameras, vibration data, TensorFlow from an analytics standpoint, and delivering a lot of value there. And we'll hear a couple Fledge use cases today and around, or about a Fledge use case today around energy. EdgeX has been doing a variety of different things, building automation, retail, also some industrial, smart cities use cases, bringing together a bunch of different providers around that open API. You mentioned the telco blueprints from Akraino. Home Edge is focused on some anomaly detection and surveillance, video-based applications within the home. And of course, Eve, as mentioned, is about industrial, how do I scale industrial IoT deployments. And a big component of Eve is not only supporting virtual machines and containers, but also how do I support industrial deployments that have connectivity that may be lost. So I need to be able to run fully autonomously when I can get updates, dial into the back end, get updates, boot it up entirely in a separate partition, make sure it's running, and only then do you flip it over. So it's an eventual consistency model in terms of how it connects to the back end and gets updates, but otherwise it will always run the way it was running before. So anyway, so a lot of different use cases that we've been working on within the community, and we'll see continuing alignment over time. So with that, Arpit, did you want to kind of run through some of the community growth?
Yeah, and actually, Jason, Arpit had to step aside, but I'll welcome our special guest, LF Edge
Jim St.
TAC Chair. Yeah, Jim St. Ledger.
Yes. All right. Okay.
Thanks, gentlemen. Thanks, everyone, for attending. I do video, but I'm on a problematic broadband connection, so apologies for that. And you just get my audio. Just a couple things. So first and foremost, from a member survey, our project now is over a year old. We brought a bunch of these open source projects together that Jason kind of walked through. And, I'm not going to read you all in here, but open source is a huge driver for a couple things in the industry. You can read reasons given in the survey here as to why people are involved in open source. It tends to be a fantastic way to go and, build yourself in opportunities to converge R&D resources together, come together with other folks, build an infrastructure, and frankly, go create a lot of what I call typically de facto standards from open source software. So tremendous momentum being built. And as Jason talked about the number of projects, I think we're up to 9 today, if I remember correctly. Making good progress in there overall. This slide talks a little bit about number of new members, up 25%, new projects, the latest being things like Open Horizon, Secure Device Onboard, et cetera, in addition to a bunch of other ones, State of the Edge, which is SOTE. From a deployment perspective, there's a lot of, the challenge in open source, of course, is you don't necessarily know who's downloading your code, but some of the folks you'll hear from later on are going to come in and share some of the use cases and talk openly about their deployments and use of projects like Fledge and others in here. So that's great because then it sort of exposes the real world of what folks are doing. The EdgeX Foundry project has been able to track their Docker downloads, and they have over 6 million to date, which is pretty massive from an open source project perspective. Especially, I think EdgeX is 3+ years old, roughly. And Akraino R3 Blueprints, there's quite a few blueprints they keep adding. They do 2 releases per year, and those blueprints have end users such as communication service providers, AT&T and the like involved in them, as well as many of the cloud service providers, especially from China, Baidu, Tencent, et cetera. So great momentum building, great opportunities for everybody else as well. Next slide, Brett. We have something called Landscape within LF Edge, and this is run underneath the State of the Edge project, or SOTE. And if you're familiar with CNCF, or Cloud Native Computing Foundation, they have a very large landscape, and we essentially are trying to create a similar approach, but rather than do it for cloud native, we're doing it for edge computing. And this is sort of giving you a snapshot on everything from, hey, where are the projects, where do they fit in, who are the companies involved in them, and then what are all the different elements and ingredients that are required from a standpoint of understanding, what you need to be doing to be successful around edge computing. So if you haven't seen this in detail, I do want to strongly encourage you to go take a look at landscape.lfedge.org. If you are involved in edge computing from any dimension that you see in there, this is open and editable by anybody. There's instructions you can find on our wiki page about how to add information and do a GitHub pull request to get new information posted into this landscape thing. It's really a representation of the community itself and frankly, the broader edge computing industry. You'll see lots of other projects and ingredients in here that come from other open source projects and other companies as well. And it's designed to be broadly representative of all of that. So next slide. Okay, so this across the top, it looks at 2 things. Next 2 slides talk about projects and membership. From a project perspective, Jason touched on these. What we do he touched on the names of the projects. Let me sort of put them into context to what we call our project maturity lifecycle. And I'm going to start on actually the right-hand side here, which is the entry point of where projects come in, the at-large stage 1. So if someone has a project that relates to edge computing, there's a well-defined process within LF Edge of how you would propose your project, what you need to do, things like, hey, you need to find 2 sponsors across the Premier membership that say, yeah, I believe in what you're trying to do. You come in with your proposal that explains kind of the structure of your project, the status of your project, right? Has it been in existence and you have a code base? You're trying to form a group to go and build something, et cetera. And then it goes through a few approval processes, both technical and from a broader governance perspective. And if approved, it moves into stage 1. And today we have 3 projects in there. We have Beetle, SDO, and excuse me, Open Horizon,
Sorry.
which came in recently. No worries, no worries. From there, as projects mature and start building out more, having more members, ingredients, et cetera, they move to what's called stage 2. And again, there's a well-defined process for that as well. In stage 2 today, we have State of the Edge, Home Edge, Fledge, and Project Eve in there. And beyond that, it moves to stage 3, which is where projects are really rocking and rolling, performing, large communities, well-defined governance structure, and large adoption and impact to the industry. And today we have 2 projects in this area, EdgeX Foundry and the Akraino Edge Stack project. So that's sort of the status of our project. If you are working on other projects and interested in it, please engage us. We're always looking to help support additional edge computing elements of things. From a membership perspective, we have a premier membership and then we have a general membership. From a premier membership perspective, you can get a look. It's sort of a who's who of a lot of companies in the industry in here that are in there. If you look on the next page, you'll see an even broader list of general members. Quite a few companies, and again, I'm sure most of you recognize these folks. It absolutely is a global project, which of course gives us a challenge of when to host various meetings for projects, for governance, for technical steering committees, et cetera. But folks, of course, as an open source, they just compromise, whether it's getting up early or staying up late to try to make that happen. The very bottom section here is associate member and liaisons. And this is largely 2 categories. So on the one hand, it could be things like universities that are interested and supportive of the project. You'll see one towards the bottom right, it says University of New Hampshire Interoperability Lab, or UNH-IOL in the world of acronym space. They're very well involved. They host the community's physical lab infrastructure, where Akraino is running a lot of their projects today and others are looking to run in there. And other projects like AECC and ETRI and others are in OpenStack Foundation, et cetera. They have an interest or an engagement point into edge computing. So for example, the OpenStack Foundation has its own edge computing project, and they're involved in LF Edge as well to look for synergies across different projects. AECC is automotive centric, et cetera. So it's really just looking for synergies across different projects and different people in there. And similarly, if you're involved in a different effort and want to come in and have a conversation with us about, hey, does my group or nonprofit or university, et cetera, fit into this space, please do reach out for us. I think there's one more slide after this one. Okay. Yeah, a couple of key takeaways, so LF Edge overall is really looking to bring together all these edge computing components. As Arpit touched on earlier, the edge means different things to different people, but it certainly reaches across Internet of Things, enterprise, cloud areas, and telecom, communication, networking, et cetera. One of the biggest goals of LF Edge as a large inclusive edge computing open source project is really to be open and interoperable. We make sure that we don't do things that are biased or blocking towards any particular vendor or solution, be that hardware, silicon, software, OS, et cetera. We work hard to be protocol independent and be able to run on multiple platforms and architecture. And my view of that, as someone who works at Intel and has a perspective, is that, yep, this works on Intel, it works on ARM solutions, it works on many platforms that are out there. We're bringing in lots of different solutions for these markets. We understand what their unique requirements are based on applications, whether it's location-based, latency requirements, mobility, et cetera. And as mentioned on the last slide, working with lots of other consortiums and standards development organizations such as AECC, ETSI, et cetera. And lastly, I talked about how LF Edge is hosted in the Linux Foundation, which has many other complementary projects such as Cloud Native Computing Foundation, the CNCF, the home of Kubernetes, and many, many other cloud native related projects. LF Networking or LF Edge, which has ONAP for automation and many other projects in there, OPNFV, FD.io, Tungsten Fabric, and many others. And then there are lots of collaborations within LF Edge with those projects. I think that's my last slide in this section.
Yeah, I would add, so, thanks, Jim. So the, you would notice if you looked at the details of the survey, a lot of folks, you normally collaborate in open source. Of course, the core reason is this shared technology investment, as I call it, avoiding undifferentiated heavy lifting. Very, very valuable in open source, but in nascent spaces like Edge, like a lot of the things that we're talking about here, shaping new business opportunities, identifying use cases is a key value, and so a lot of folks that are collaborating, saw that as one of the biggest value points within LF Edge. So, and we see that in the same regard, collaborating across various different communities. So, a lot of benefits to coming into the community, benefits to a member, being a member as far as that goes. And then of course it's open source, so that, completely a technical meritocracy. Best way to vote on that front is with your keyboard writing code. So real quick, we'll talk about the vertical solution groups, and then we'll take a break and start the oil and gas session. I think we're kind of right there, but this is a precedent set by the CNCF, in LF networking other groups within LF Edge. The whole goal here is to get requirements for end users and feed those back into the projects. So we're taking both that horizontal and vertical approach. The output of these can be additional feature requirements for the various different projects. We'll create vertical specific demos. There's blueprints that we're building within Akraino, how we message things, etc. So super valuable feedback from various different markets. We've had a couple that we've spun up previously within certain projects. There's some details online. Any of these you can get involved in if you're in these spaces and would like to get involved. Today, of course, we're talking specifically about oil and gas and energy. And if you would like to lead a new vertical solution group as an end user, basically you submit a proposal to info@lfedge.org. As long as it's including at least one LF Edge project, we're good to go. Definitely would like to see multiple projects within a given user group, but we're definitely welcoming contributions from one and all around getting that feedback into the overall community. Joining the TAC is a great way to get, the Technical Advisory Committee is a great way to keep up to date on things. And in general, we just encourage people to get engaged. You can get a Linux Foundation ID, dive in on the wiki, dive in the various different projects. Everything is run as an open community, so that there's a level of transparency that makes sure that we're driving open interoperability across the different elements within LF Edge. So with that, we'll take a quick break. If you're interested in the oil and gas session, hop over in a few minutes. There's a unique link for that next session. So it'll be a different Zoom session. Obi and I will be talking about oil and gas. Obi's with Schlumberger and their industrial IoT architect. So we'll see you over there.
Perfect.
Right,
and for those who will be joining, if you go back to the program page on your swap card platform, you'll see a link to join the next session. So we'll see you there. Thanks all.